Hello, everyone. Hope all is going well with you. Just want to share some thoughts with you from an article I read that was written by Dr. Kelvin Onongha. Dr. Onongha wrote on the topic of prayer, and particularly from the perspective of how we use prayer to advance mission. He shared 6 points in terms of the article, and I'd like to share them with you. I found them to be quite insightful and helpful as I conduct ministry. The first thing that he says in terms of the opening of the article is that we look at prayer from the perspective of a relationship with God many times. He's suggesting that we should now consider prayer from the standpoint of how we use it to advance the work of God. All right, the primary focus should be how we use prayer to advance the work of God. The first point that he makes is that we should look at prayer as persistence, or from the perspective of persistence. What does he highlights 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 41 and 44. That's where Elijah prayed with regards to the rain situation, right? Drought in Israel. And he mentioned that he prayed several times before an answer was received. He also mentioned that Jesus taught his disciples that they should not just pray, but they should be persistent in their prayer lives, right? Matthew 7:7, right? The emphasis here is on continuous prayer. So knock, seek, ask, right? He highlights a Greek word that is used in Luke 11, 1 to 8. The Greek word that he gave was anadeia. I believe that's how you pronounce it. It's a unique word in scripture. He says it's a composite of two words, shameless and audaciousness. In other words, he says audacious, persistent petitions in mission endeavors will find their mark, right? And he says here, in terms of persistent prayer, he says that our persistence in prayer reflects how much we trust that God is able, willing, and ready to answer whenever we call on him for help. Second thing that he points out is that we should look at prayer from the standpoint of rebellion. Of course, individuals may find this surprising, but the whole idea here is that we are living in a world, right, that suggests that we go a certain way, and that certain way is usually against God. But he's suggesting here that we need to, in our prayer life, do things in a way that suggests that we're going against what the status quo is, and we are going for God, right? He highlights the widow in Luke 18, verse 1 to 8, where she wanted justice. She wanted something done, and she was and she rebelled against the idea that because she's of a certain status, she is not going to be able to get justice, right? Another point in terms of rebellion that he points out is that when it comes to being rebellious in our prayer life, is that we are basically telling God that we want him, right, to step in and do some things for us. He made a very strong point on that point where he says that we have to use a rebellious prayer life to say to the pharaohs of this world, and I love this point, to say to the pharaohs of this world that we want you to release God's people so that we can get on with mission. Third thing that he points out is that it's an imagery of prayer in terms of aggression. And the point that he makes here is that when it comes to being aggressive in our prayer life, he highlights Ephesians 12, where Paul talks about, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, and he talks about the whole concept of spiritual warfare, right? And he says we have to see prayer as a form of aggression against spiritual wickedness and all the different challenges that come our way in this life, right? But not just as far as a personal standpoint is concerned. He's highlighting this from the perspective of advancing God's work. We got to be aggressive in our prayer life. Intercession is number 4. Intercession. And, in terms of what he says here, he says intercession is something that Christian put on the high list in terms of praying, right? This is the loftiest, he says, of the prayers. The whole idea here is that we're praying on behalf of others, or we're praying on behalf of someone else, right? And he said we should do this as especially as we think of individuals in various places trying to do the work of God, and there are certain powers and entities that are preventing this. We should definitely try to pray that God will move on behalf of these individuals and see his work advance. Number five, he points out submission. And when he pointed out submission, he highlighted Jesus Christ, of course, from his ministry, and he highlighted Hebrews chapter 10, 5-7, and he highlighted Philippians 2, of Christ taking on the form of a man and submitting himself to God, even unto death, right? So he gave the example of Jesus Christ, of course. He talks about the fact that in terms of submission, the apostles were successful because they submitted to the will of God. And there is an analogy that he used here. He quoted a gentleman named E. Stanley Jones, and he said here, in quoting him, when you throw a hook out from a boat, are you being pulled to the land, or are you pulling the land to you? So the whole idea when it comes to prayer is that we must be humble. We must practice humility. Earnestness is number 6 and the last point. And the whole idea here when it comes to earnest prayer, he said it's not about the length of it, right? Or its intensity, right? The length in terms of effectiveness, but its intensity here. So the whole idea is that we should be intense in our prayer lives, right? As far as it, as we think of, what needs to be done for the work of God, and what are some of the things that needs to happen, we should spend more time, not in terms of length, but in terms of putting it out before God and letting him know that we want this thing done to advance your kingdom, right? He said Christians need to be more cautious against developing a magical attitude when it comes to prayer. In other words, you're putting all the different aspects to prayer to create some magical formula, and that will allow things to work out so that God will do his thing and work on our behalf. So he says we should guard against that. Prayer is a powerful tool, right? And because it's so powerful, we should definitely utilize it and make it a part of our lives. Hope you're blessed by these points. I will talk to you again, but remember, only what you do for Christ will last. Blessings.